The world had stopped making sense. And I was feeling lost too, and full of anger and disappointment. So I just wanted to be alone in nature for a while. And I set out to make a documentary on the longest trail in the world.
What a treat today to be joined by Dianne Whalen. I'm going to have a bit of a story about your name before we get into 500 Days in the Wild. You and I were chatting before we started recording, and you've got a French-English background. So it's actually Dianne Whalen, Dianne French, Whalen English. We're going to call you D for the rest of it. But before we talk about 500 Days in the Wild, where's the French-English connection for you?
So my mother is from a very small Acadian village called Saint-Damien near Bucktouche in New Brunswick. And my ancestors have been there since the Dérangement from Nova Scotia in the 1700s. So they've been there a long time. And so that's French. That's where the French comes from. Beautiful culture. And then my father is a Newfoundlander and also family there now for a few centuries. Both a townie. His father was a townie, meaning he's from St. John's, and his last name was Ed Whalen. And my grandmother was Mary Whalen from a small town a port town called Kings Cove, but went into St. John's when she was quite young to be a nanny. And so, yes, my deepest roots on this land are in the Maritimes.
What a beautiful heritage. Now, from the Maritimes to the other coast, again, we were talking before we started recording this, and I commented on the beautiful backdrop there. We got a lovely roaring fire going. You look nice and cozy. Where does this interview find you today?
Well, today I'm sitting in my home where I've lived for about 26 years. Of course, I leave here. I was gone for many years while I was on 500 Days in the Wild. But I live in Garden Bay, which is a small fishing village, a few hours north of Vancouver on the coast. And that's where we're sitting here today in Garden Bay, BC.
Well, it's great that you had time to join us. I know you've got a busy schedule. So let's talk about 500 Days in the Wild. What inspired you to take this 24,000 kilometer, 6-year journey on the Trans-Canada Trail?
Well, I am a filmmaker. I have made a documentary on Everest, and I've made a documentary on Canada's most northern coastline, which is the northwest coast of Ellesmere Island, right up there across from Greenland. So I make adventure films, and this is the longest recreational trail in the world. It was scheduled to open up July 1st, 2017. It's made up of 487 different trails, the Trans-Canada Trail, both land and water trails, and it connects 3 oceans. So from a professional perspective, it seemed like the natural next step, right? I've been to the highest mountain, and I'd been on the most northern coastline. So on paper, the longest trail in the world seemed like a really good next film on paper. And it was actually, and all joking aside, it was an amazing life experience. So on a professional perspective, that was why. On a personal perspective, I had just turned 50, literally in May, and I left in July. And my life had gone through some changes. And a marriage I'd been in had ended. A dog that I'd owned for 16 years had just died. And so everything that was holding me to one spot was gone. And I thought, maybe you could call this your classic midlife crisis. But for me, I just thought, you know what, maybe it's time to check out, to check in, And so it ticked off all the boxes, right? Professionally, but also on a personal level, I was really ready to have this experience.
This documentary really captures the essence of what this was all about. And I guess it might be hard to pick a couple because I can only imagine how many there must have been. And the cinematography is stunning. But for you, what were a couple of really impactful, memorable things that if I said to you, give me your top 3, right away they pop into your mind? What were they and why?
That is a really difficult question to ask because people would always ask me, like, what's your favorite part of the trail? And I'd always say, and honestly, it was the part that I was on at any given time. All of it was new for me. I had never done any of the 487 trails that are stitched together to create the Trans-Canada Trail. So it was all new territory for me. I would say that probably surprisingly, my favorite parts of the trail were the water trails. About 8,000 kilometers of this journey was done in a canoe, and I'd done a little bit of canoeing, but nothing like what I went on. And the water trails are the most ancient trails in Canada. And so they just, and they also are the most remote and the wildest sections of the trail. So for me, I loved those. And they included the Bredor Lake in Cape Breton. They included the St. John River, the Shubenacadie River. They included Lake Superior. They included a 4,000 kilometer paddle to the Arctic Ocean from Alberta. So there was and a big paddle at the end on the Salish Sea, Pacific Ocean. So yeah, all of those were amazing experiences for me. And I met kind people everywhere. It would be hard to isolate one.
Yeah, Canada is such a huge country, and it's so diverse, not only in its weather and its landscapes, but in its people. What were some of those experiences like as you encountered different communities and different, people with different backgrounds, whether it's Indigenous people or Francophone or whatever, prairie people, East Coast people? What were some of those things like, and how did they impact you?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. First of all, like when I left, like a lot of people, I used to read the news every day and watch the news every day before I left. And it was hard not to feel like the world was full of psychopaths, frankly, when you watch the news, because we give shadow the front page of the newspaper and we give shadow the lead story in the news. So I was kind of fed up. But what I discovered almost immediately in Newfoundland and onward, I mean, for 6 years, I never met one unkind person. I was very vulnerable. I'm a woman traveling alone. For the most part, I wasn't carrying anything really, apart from bear spray. I did carry a 12 gauge when I went into the high Arctic, but that was just for a small part of the journey. And that's because we're on the food chain up there. But yeah, I was most part quite vulnerable out there, and all I met were kind people, whether I was lost in the woods as happened in Nova Scotia one night. And it was November in 2015, just a couple months into my journey. And I hit like a hurricane type storm in Nova Scotia in the woods, and I got lost. And, I was found late at night in very heavy rain and winds by a couple hunters, Jimmy and Brad, and they brought me back to their hunting cabin. And I'll tell you, as a woman, when you're lost in the woods at night by yourself, when I first saw Jimmy and Brad in their little army fatigues with their hunting guns, I was terrified. And not because I should have been, because you know what? They were amazing men. They were kind men. They were good fathers, brothers, friends, fabulous human beings. But when we're afraid, everything that comes at us is through the lens of fear. And I guess that was one of my first lessons on the journey, was to be reminded that when we are afraid, we're perceiving everything through that lens of fear, but it's probably not right. Because as it turned out, they were fantastic, really kind people who helped me, warm me up that night. They made me deer meat, gave me a cigar. The next day, they brought me back to the trail where I had veered off on the wrong direction. This kind of kindness I met everywhere. I also spent a lot of time in Indigenous communities across this land. I'm a settler descent, and that part of the journey, it's an adventure film, but that part of the journey was about listening and learning and try to sort of unpack what reconciliation could mean for me. And what I learned about that was reconciliation can sound like this very big word. We politicized it. It's like an academic thing. But when you strip it down, what reconciliation means is kinship. It means friendship. It means getting to know each other, holding each other's babies, and sharing some food. And that's what I did for 6 years as I crossed this land.
Incredible to just hear you talk with the passion that you do about this 6-year journey and the experiences. And something else that your documentary touches on are the themes of climate change. And we hear so much about it. And I think the average person really doesn't truly understand the impacts of climate change and how tangible it is. We see the clickbait and we see the sensational headlines, but taking this 6-year journey across Canada, experiencing the vastness of this country, What were some things that you witnessed that you said to yourself, wow, this is tangible. I sense what's happening with our world, with our climate?
Well, certainly the paddle to the Arctic. I would say the Arctic is on the front lines. The most frozen part of what has been Canada is the part that's changing the most and the fastest. The ocean is warming up. The ice in the Arctic is melting from the top down. Or no, sorry, from the bottom up. Sorry. That was how it confused me, is that I always thought, the ice is melting, but actually it's the ocean water melting the ice from the bottom up, from what I learned in talking to Dene hunters and Dene people as I traveled to the north and in Inuvik, is that is the big problem for them. It's really hard to read the ice. Also, of course, forest fires. As I paddled up to the Arctic, I did the Slave River and Peace River and the Mackenzie River and Great Slave Lake. And you'll see in the film, there are scenes where like out of nowhere come these massive fires. I think we need a megaphone really up in the north right now, a call out to what's happening. Even the community of Tuktoyaktuk, which is right on the Arctic Ocean, that was the end of my that was the point I had to paddle to, heading up north. And this entire community is falling into the ocean. They have to pick up and move every single house, and every single person will have to be relocated. It's a process that's already begun because the land that they have traditionally been on is literally permafrost, and it's collapsing and falling into the sea. So it's definitely very visually noticeable. Even as I was paddling on the rivers, the sides of these rivers, the permafrost is just collapsing into the water, trees collapsing into the water. There were days where it was like a floating forest in the rivers, so some of it's normal in spring. It picks up wood on the side, but this is beyond that. And I guess another thing that I saw and witnessed was that in the Mackenzie River, they now have salmon. The salmon have never been up in the Mackenzie River. So salmon traditionally will go back to the place that they are born in order to spawn and die. That is as old as, humanity, right? Salmon, what salmon do, the life cycle of the salmon. For the salmon to now be in the Mackenzie River means that some salmon have not returned to the place of their birth. And I think what they're being drawn to are the cooler waters. Part of the loss of salmon has to do, again, with the warming of the water. They need a certain temperature in order to lay their eggs. And if the oceans are too warm, in order to spawn and survive, they need to find colder waters. So those were firsthand sort of observations. And when you're on the land like that, where, you're getting your information from are people who have lived on that land and whose families have lived in the same place for centuries. Indigenous people, but also other families, who are like third, fourth, fifth generation, fishermen, or third, fourth, fifth generation farming. And those are the people who have eyes on the things that are happening, and it's just a story I kept hearing over and over and over again. And that is how fast things were changing. And we see it. I mean, look how warm our winter has been in Canada this year, right? I mean, I think we just, from my understanding, experienced our warmest February in recorded history all around the world. So it's clearly something that we all got a front seat to right now.
Yeah, as I sit here in our office in Halifax, it's mild, it's raining, and all the snow we had over a couple of weeks is now gone. You mentioned salmon, which makes me think of wildlife. And oh my goodness, your documentary again captures so many encounters with wildlife. What would be a couple? I live where I live. It's kind of wildernessy. And a friend of mine who also lives in the area posted a picture of a bobcat the other day. And I was like, oh, a bobcat. Oh, I better keep an eye for that. If I get home and it's dark, it's a bobcat. You're in Canada, the vastest of this country, for 6 years, 24,000 kilometers. What are one or two encounters with wildlife that you're like, uh-oh, this is not good?
Well, fortunately for me, because I am a filmmaker, most of those exchanges with wildlife were extremely exciting moments for me. I actually had a rebirth I've been taking photographs for 35 years now, making documentaries for close to 20 years now. And while I was out there, I had a rebirth in my enthusiasm and excitement, especially for wildlife photography and cinematography. I had, everything from foxes and wolves to moose and grizzly bears and bears. And most of them were just, like I said, to be both the observer and the observed when you're in nature and you're documenting animals. And, there's something really profound about these moments of trust that happen. Especially the longer I stayed out there, whatever was changing inside of me, I think one word might be resonance. It's like the energy that we emit when we, through our emotions, I guess. I'm not a scientist, but all I know is my exchanges got more and more where the animals trusted me more over the years. And I was able to spend sometimes hours watching a family of moose, and these were amazing moments. And, there's something ancient that wakes up in your DNA out there. I mean, you go from feeling extremely fragile, alone in the deep forests of Quebec on an old fur trader trail, or being alone on Lake Superior when you haven't heard or seen another person for weeks, or anything, any planes or anything, nothing, boats, nothing. Something ancient wakes up inside you. And what that is you suddenly, like, even though you're not with any people, you start feeling more connected to life than you ever have. I had ever had. And that's this realization that, humans are just 0.001% of all life on Earth. And so when we're out there, and especially, whether it's for a day walk or whether you're out there for an extended period of time, when you're in nature, you start to connect to that other 99.9%. And the longer I stayed out there, that more alive I started feeling, because I was getting more and more reconnected to that web of life. And that's continuously inspired me. And I always tell people the hardest part, or my hardest day, wasn't any day on the trail. It was the day I had to come off the trail when I had finished it. Those were the hardest days, because what a total gift to have given myself, to have been able to walk away from my bills and, being on that mouse wheel and do the things that I absolutely adore and love, which is to film, which is to be in nature, which is to write, and just slow it down, like not be driven by a watch, but just go as far as I could every day and tried my best every day. And that was good enough, and it was an amazing feeling.
This documentary is certainly about resilience and empowerment, and in particular, again, for women like yourself over 50. But for all audiences that watch this documentary, what message do you want to convey to them? What do you want them coming out of that film or watching that on a stream? Or what do you want audiences to get from it?
I hope lots of things. One of the things I hope for is that you just feel so much better coming out than you did going in. That, like me, through the course of this film, you will see all the kindness of people that I met across this land. And that you will also be reminded that, I think it's wonderful that we celebrate our cultural differences in Canada. Absolutely. One of the strongest strengths we have as a nation is that cultural diversity. But I also think it's really important that we remember what we all share. And, all those years I was out there, all those hundreds of people that I met that helped me, if not thousands, I don't know any of their political parties. We never talked about, are you liberal? Are you NDP? Are you conservative? Because it just didn't matter. What mattered was we were both found ourselves out there in nature at the same time. And in those moments, it was like, hey, did you see the moose prints? I think the moose are around here somewhere. Or, hey, you want to sit by my fire and like have a cup of tea? Or, hey, there's some really good drinking water down there. Or anything. We talked about our loves and our passions and the things that we could share. We didn't dwell on how we might be different. And I think that is something, it's a medicine that we all need maybe right now to hear. And also just to be reminded that 99.9% of the people in this world are kind, and just really check in, like as I had to do, as you see me do in this film. I had to unpack and check in and strip away those labels that I had put on people too, because I remembered, I mean, the currency of 500 days is human kindness. So I really hope that can land on people. I really hope too for other people of settler descent that they can get inspired, that my reconciliation journey isn't the way for everybody, but it's my way. And just putting that out there and sharing that perhaps in some way it'll help other Canadians of settler descent also connect to that journey for themselves. And like I said, it's kinship. It's just unpacking that, it's becoming friends, because if we're friends, then we really want to get to know each other, and our minds expand by understanding the different ways of looking at the world. And one of the most important, I learned so much in my time in those communities, but one of the profound things that I learned, which is seen in the film, is that there isn't really such a big gap between the Western worldview and Indigenous worldview. One is on the earth and one is with the earth. And, in order to find a safe way navigating our way through the future, I think we have to come back to living with the earth and not on the earth. So personally, I found great hope there too in the ideas. I meet this woman in New Brunswick, Cecilia Brooks. And actually this idea comes from a man named Albert Marshall, who taught university out in Cape Breton. It's called the two-eyed ways of seeing. And it is about that Western worldview working together with an Indigenous worldview together to have a more complete picture of the ecology. And I found great hope in this idea. I still feel great hope in this idea in terms of how we might move forward to take people through danger to safety, because those are some of the things that we're going to have to do coming into the future in dealing with climate change and how that's going to impact all of us and the world that we live in.
Inspiring for sure. We'll wrap up with you here in a second, but you mentioned some of the life-altering events that kind of all amalgamated together to lead you to take this 6-year, 24,000-kilometer journey. What was the biggest change that you've seen in yourself when it was all said and done?
Basically, the importance of human connection. Coming into university in the 80s, I studied philosophy and political philosophy and political theory and McGill University. And I was really enamored by individualism. So much of Western culture is really focused on the importance of the individual and individual rights. And of course, these are all very good things. But I think that too much individualism, at least for me anyway, is a sickness. There's a scene in the film where that really hits home. And, I'm dragging the canoe out of the forest by myself after being frozen out. And it really hits me, and some of the wisdom, again, I gained hanging out in Mi'kmaq communities in Cape Breton, but just this idea that we are like the trees, on the surface, every tree looks like it stands alone, but beneath the surface, all the roots of those trees are interconnected. And so too are we, So for me, the biggest takeaway, that way that it changed me, is I went from probably overly romanticizing individualism in my life to really understanding the importance of human connection to myself, to the world around me, to my community, to my family, to my friends, and to strangers that we meet, just the importance of human connection.
I know that it's been screening at different areas and there's more screenings to come. But for anyone watching, listening, how can they find out more about you, about 500 Days in the Wild, how they can see it, when they can see it?
Oh, thank you. Well, we have a website, 500daysinthewild.com. On that website, there's a page called Screenings, and we are doing our best every day to upload cinemas across Canada that are screening the film. And we are really putting a lot of focus right now. We hope to have something in St. John's and Moncton very soon. We have been at the Park Lane Cinema in Halifax, but we are looking at expanding that. We also have screenings in Charlottetown and PEI right now. But we're always looking for community cinemas and independent cinemas out there that are interested in programming the film. Those are the cinemas that are having the most success with 500 Days. We've got cinemas doing in Toronto right now, the Fox Theatre, night after night. We are having sellouts there and in Vernon. So yeah, we're trying to find a home right now for the film in every city across Canada and every town across Canada. And the ones that we don't meet right now through the official theatrical, I'm hoping to do a grassroots tour in the fall, because I want to make sure this film comes back to every community across this land that was there to support me, because you're all part of this story. And I want to make sure every Canadian has an opportunity to experience it. It will eventually be streaming in Canada, but I can't urge you enough the importance of seeing it in a cinema, not only because it's an important thing culturally for our country to support our films if we want them to continue being made, but also because, as I said, this is a film about human connection. And when you go into a cinema, it's not unlike back in the old days when our ancestors sat around a fire and listened to a story, because we share story in those moments. When we're in a theater and they drop the lights, we are going to laugh together. We're going to cry together. We're going to rock out to an incredible soundtrack with Joni Mitchell and the Tragically Hip, amongst others. So we have this collective emotional experience in the dark, and that is human connection. And that is exactly what this film is all about. So get to a cinema, ideally a community cinema. So you're hanging out with your community and your friends, and you're laughing and you're crying and you're having a great time.
Dianne Whalen, 500 Days in the Wild is extraordinary. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us here, and we wish you continued success, and hopefully we'll connect again down the road.
You bet. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.